October 1942. The desert is already cold at night, but the days still burn the skin and bleach every color into the same dusty haze. In a shallow depression behind a line of scrub and shattered rock, British engineers kneel in the sand with spanners and canvas, working not on a weapon that will fire, but on a weapon that will be believed. A tank sits silent, its steel hull dull with dust. Over it they fit a frame like a skeleton, then stretch painted fabric across it until, from a distance, the armored shape becomes a plain supply lorry. The turret disappears. The tracks vanish into shadow. The gun becomes a harmless beam. The enemy pilots, who look down from the sky, will not see an armored spearhead. They will see transport. They will see routine. They will see nothing worth urgent attention. In war, the first battle is often fought in the mind. And tonight, the desert is about to witness a deception built on patience, discipline, and the most dangerous promise a commander can make. You will attack where the enemy does not expect, and you will make him accept it as truth. By the autumn of 1942, the North African campaign has become a grinding test of endurance and supply. The Axis and the Allies are chained to long lines of fuel, water, ammunition, and replacement parts, stretched over hostile terrain and vulnerable ports. Whoever controls the rhythm of movement and the flow of supplies controls the tempo of battle. At El Alamein, the British 8th Army and the Axis forces face each other across a narrow corridor between the Mediterranean Sea and the impassable Qattara Depression. There is no room for grand sweeping maneuvers. There is no flank to ride around. If there will be a decisive battle, it will be here, and it will be a battle of prepared positions, minefields, artillery, and attrition. The Axis commander, Erwin Rommel, is famed for improvisation and speed, but here he is forced to hold, to dig, to conserve fuel, and to guess. The British have suffered reverses and humiliations. They have also learned. They have replaced leaders. They have reorganized. They have rebuilt their supply system. Now they want a blow that will not merely push the enemy back, but break him. The British commander, Bernard Montgomery, arrives with a promise that becomes a kind of vow to the army. There will be no retreat. He studies the ground, the mine belts, the artillery ranges, the enemy's strong points, and the limitations of a battlefield with no open flank. He understands that the battle must be won in stages. First, the minefields must be breached. Then the enemy defenses must be cracked. Then the armored reserves must be drawn in and destroyed. He wants to choose the place and the time, and he wants to arrive at that moment with the maximum weight of men, tanks, and guns. But he also understands a brutal truth. If the enemy knows where the main blow will fall, the enemy will reinforce that sector, thicken minefields, shift anti-tank guns, and prepare his reserves to counterattack the moment the breakthrough begins. If the enemy expects the time, he will prepare his fuel, his ammunition, his alertness, and his air patrols. If the enemy believes you will attack in the north, he will be ready in the north. If he believes you will attack soon, he will be ready now. So the battle plan needs a companion plan, one that will not kill the enemy directly, but will misplace his attention and his strength. That companion plan becomes Operation Bertram. Operation Bertram is not a single trick. It is a system. It is built from dozens of small, consistent signals designed to create a larger picture in the enemy mind. A picture that seems logical, that matches what the enemy already suspects, and that is supported by what he can observe with his eyes and cameras. The goal is simple to describe and difficult to achieve. Convince the Axis that the main British attack will come in the south, and that it will come later than it truly will. While the real attack mass forms in the north and prepares to strike earlier, the deception must withstand repeated observation. It must survive aerial reconnaissance. It must look more real than reality itself. It must also be executed without breaking the rhythm of the army, because the army still has to eat, refuel, practice, and move. A deception that disrupts the real preparations becomes a self-inflicted wound. Bertram has to lie smoothly, quietly, and at scale. The desert is an unforgiving stage for such a performance. There are few trees, few buildings, few shadows. A tracked vehicle leaves obvious marks. A new road shines pale against older ground. A concentration of vehicles kicks up dust and reveals itself from miles away. A new supply dump appears as a pattern of rectangles. A pipeline leaves a line that can be traced from the air. A camp, even camouflaged, changes the texture of the ground. The Axis have experienced aerial scouts. They also have a strong reason to watch. They know the British are preparing. They know a large battle is coming. They need to decide where it will land, because they do not have unlimited reserves. They do not have unlimited fuel. They cannot reinforce every point equally, so they watch and they interpret. Bertram begins with the idea that the enemy should see a build-up in the south. That feels like the early stage of a major offensive. To support this, British planners want to create the appearance of infrastructure and supply preparation, aimed toward the southern sector. One of the clearest pieces of evidence an enemy can observe is a pipeline, because water is life in the desert. A major offensive requires enormous quantities of water for men, vehicles, and medical stations. If a pipeline is advancing toward a sector, it suggests that an army intends to operate there. Bertram uses this logic. The British create the impression of a pipeline being built toward the south, but they build it slowly and openly, at a pace that suggests the offensive cannot begin until the pipeline reaches farther forward. Every day the line seems to creep a little more. Every day it appears that the British are still preparing and still not ready. The schedule embedded in the pipeline becomes the schedule embedded in the enemy mind. It says, "Not yet" at the same time. The real pipeline and supply preparations for the actual attack in the north are built and concealed as much as possible, protected by camouflage, movement at night, and strict discipline. Where the false pipeline is meant to be seen, the real pipeline is meant to be overlooked. Where the false project is meant to signal time, the real project is meant to be finished before the enemy realizes what it means. This dual structure becomes the heartbeat of Bertram: visible preparation in the wrong place, invisible readiness in the right place. But a pipeline alone is not enough. The enemy also measures strength by counting vehicles, especially armored vehicles. Tanks are the decisive instruments in a desert battle, and the Axis know it. If the British are massing tanks in the north, Axis commanders will shift anti-tank guns and reserves accordingly. So the British face a problem. They need tanks in the north, but they need those tanks to look like something else. This is where Bertram becomes famous, because it uses physical disguise on a scale that seems almost absurd until you realize how methodical it is. The British employ camouflage devices that could be fitted over vehicles. The most iconic is a frame and canvas cover that makes a tank resemble a lorry when seen from the air. In daylight, when the enemy aircraft fly, the armored units appear to be transport columns and supply vehicles, the kind of routine traffic that exists everywhere and does not necessarily signal an imminent assault. At night, the covers are removed and the tanks move into forward positions. In the morning, before reconnaissance can return, the covers are put back on. The tanks turn into lorries again. Day after day, the enemy sees the same harmless shapes. Meanwhile, the real armored mass creeps closer to the launch area. Hidden in plain sight behind a lie, the deception works only if the details are consistent. A lorry column has a certain spacing. It parks in a certain way. It uses certain tracks. It visits supply points. A tank unit behaves differently, and a skilled observer can tell the difference. So the British enforce patterns. They control movement. They manage tracks. They prepare false roads and hide real ones. They even think about the shadows cast by objects at different times of day. They consider how canvas reflects sunlight compared to metal. They consider the shape of a vehicle at a glance from altitude. Bertram is not a magic trick. It is a daily discipline carried out by thousands of hands. In the south, the opposite transformation occurs. If the enemy should believe there is a strong armored threat in the south, then the south must show armored strength even where there is none. This means creating dummy tanks, dummy guns, dummy vehicles, and dummy camps. The British build decoys from simple materials, wood, canvas, and painted frames. From a distance and from the air, these shapes create the impression of mass. They are arranged in patterns that look like real units. They sit near false supply dumps. They are connected to false track marks. They are integrated into a broader picture of a growing southern offensive. The enemy does not need to be fooled into thinking each dummy tank is real in a close inspection. The enemy only needs to be persuaded that, in aggregate, the British are building strength in the south and are not yet ready to strike. That is enough to shape decisions. This is the psychological center of Bertram. It does not demand that the enemy be blind. It demands that the enemy be reasonable. It asks him to use his intelligence and experience, and then it feeds that intelligence a steady diet of evidence. That points toward the wrong conclusion. It does not shout. It whispers every day in the same direction. To understand why this matters, you have to feel the pressure on the Axis side. Rommel has fought hard and fast, but by late 1942 his supply situation is strained. His fuel is precious, and his forces are worn. He knows he is outnumbered. He knows the British have improved. He also knows that if he guesses wrong, he may not have the mobility to correct the mistake in time. Shifting reserves is not easy when fuel is limited and when the battlefield is constrained. He cannot afford to bounce his armored divisions back and forth on false alarms. He must choose. So he watches and decides, and that is exactly what Bertram wants him to do. Bertram also plays with timing. In many battles, the enemy can sense an impending offensive because the tempo of activity rises. Supply dumps swell. Roads become crowded. Artillery pieces move forward. Airfields become busy. Signals traffic changes. All of this can be detected. So Bertram tries to make this rising tempo appear to belong to a later date. The false pipeline suggests an unfinished preparation. The dummy buildup in the south suggests the effort is focused there. The disguised tanks in the north suggest the armored units are not yet massed for a strike. The visible patterns of transport in the north suggest routine rather than assault. The enemy sees movement, but movement that looks like preparation, not execution. The enemy sees growth, but growth that looks incomplete. Meanwhile, the real plan for the battle is hard, direct, and violent. The British intend to smash through minefields with infantry supported by engineers, then push armor through the gaps to exploit and destroy. The initial assault will be supported by a tremendous artillery barrage, a wall of fire designed to suppress and disorient. The battle will be a contest of stamina, and the British want to force the Axis to feed their reserves into a grinding furnace. The deception is meant to ensure that, when the furnace door opens, the Axis step forward on the wrong foot. As the days pass, Bertram grows like a slow tide. More dummy vehicles appear in the south. False camps spread. The false pipeline creeps onward. The enemy photographs it. The enemy files reports. The enemy analysts draw lines on maps. In the north, real units arrive and disappear under disguise. At night, the desert becomes a moving machine. Columns roll forward with lights masked, engines muted as much as possible. Guided by rehearsed routes, engineers prepare lanes through minefields. They mark paths. They stockpile equipment for bridging and clearing. The rhythm is relentless. Every morning, before the sun brings the enemy scouts, the visible picture must be restored to the lie. The camouflage teams face practical problems that no one sees in the romantic version of deception. Canvas tears. Frames break. Windstorms whip sand into everything. Vehicles need maintenance, and maintenance exposes reality. Crews become tired and impatient. A single careless track can reveal a concentration. A single parked vehicle at the wrong angle can betray its true shape. A single shiny metal reflection can attract a camera. So commanders enforce discipline. They train. They inspect. They punish errors. Deception at this scale is like building a theater set while the enemy flies over it every day. It requires craftsmen and soldiers at the same time. There is also the question of plausibility. A false buildup must match what the enemy expects the British to do. The Axis know the British have been cautious. They expect heavy preparation. They expect logistical buildup. They might believe the British will attack in the south because the terrain there offers certain routes, and because previous fighting has included probing in that sector. They might also believe the British will delay to gather even more strength. Bertram leans into these expectations. It does not invent an alien plan. It reinforces a plan that the enemy can imagine. The battle that finally comes does not arrive with a polite warning. On the night of October 23, 1942, the British unleash an enormous artillery barrage that tears across the Axis lines. The sky flashes. The desert shakes. Infantry advance into minefields under fire in a grim, controlled walk through a landscape designed to kill them. Engineers work under bullets, clearing lanes, marking paths, trying to keep the assault from choking on its own complexity. This opening phase, known in the British plan as Operation Lightfoot, is a brutal test of coordination. It is also the moment when deception must end, because violence is the most honest signal on earth. Yet even here, the earlier deception matters, because it shapes where the enemy expects the main thrust and how quickly he commits reserves. In the first hours, confusion spreads through the Axis command. Reports coming from different sectors. The noise of battle, the disruption of communications, and the fog of war blur the picture. In this chaos, prior expectations exert a powerful pull. If you have been convinced that the main attack will be in the south, you may interpret northern violence as diversion or preliminary action. If you have been convinced that the British are not ready until later, you may underestimate the scale of what is happening now. Bertram has been planning these assumptions. Now the battle tests them, Axis commanders respond as best they can. They shift forces. They reinforce strong points. They try to identify the main breach. They try to hold the line while preserving their armor for counterattack. But every movement costs fuel and time. Every wrong movement costs the chance to fix a later mistake. The British barrage and assault are designed to grind down the defenders. But the British also need the Axis to make choices under pressure. Because choices under pressure are where deception pays dot as the days continue. The battle becomes a grinding, bloody struggle. Minefields, anti-tank guns, and stubborn defensive positions slow the British. The Axis fight hard, often in small pockets of resistance that refuse to collapse quickly. Tanks burn. Infantry suffer. Commanders adjust plans. Montgomery persists. He continues feeding strength into the sectors that matter. He continues applying pressure until the defense begins to crack. Eventually, the British achieve the breakthrough they need. Axis units begin to retreat. The battle that had seemed static finally turns into movement, and movement favors the side with better supply. Operation Bertram does not win the battle by itself. No deception can replace artillery, infantry courage, engineering skill, and the brutal mathematics of attrition. But Bertram helps the British arrive at the critical moment, with less interference than they might have faced if the Axis had concentrated their best defenses exactly where the blow would land, and if they had been fully convinced of the exact timing. Deception reduces the efficiency of enemy response. It forces hesitation. It encourages misallocation. It buys hours and sometimes days, and in a battle of logistics and reserves, hours and days can be everything. The deeper lesson of Bertram is not that the Axis were foolish. The lesson is that they were human. They collected evidence. They used logic. They relied on experience. And they tried to build a coherent picture under stress. Bertram fed them a coherent picture that happened to be wrong. The decoy tanks in the South did not need to be perfect replicas. They needed to be consistent with the narrative. The disguised tanks in the North did not need to be invisible. They needed to be boring. The false pipeline did not need to function. It needed to promise readiness later. This is how operational deception works. It builds a story the enemy will tell himself, and then it makes the story feel supported by what he can observe. Imagine what it looks like from the air, because aerial reconnaissance is the enemy eye. A pilot flies over the British rear areas and sees the southern sector with visible signs of growth. New tracks, new shapes, patterns that resemble camps and vehicle parks, and a pipeline creeping forward day by day. In the north, he sees what looks like transport concentration, which in itself is not shocking because armies always move supplies. He might see fewer obvious signs of armored mass than he would expect for a major offensive. He returns, the photographs are analyzed, the reports are written, and the conclusion forms. Then the conclusion guides the next request for fuel allocations, for repositioning anti-tank guns, for alertness levels, for reserve placement. A decision made in an office based on a photograph can kill men at the front. Bertram aims at that office, at that decision. There is also a quieter triumph in Bertram. It demonstrates that warfare is not only about machines and numbers. It is about creativity under constraint. It is about thousands of soldiers doing small tasks correctly for weeks, without the satisfaction of seeing immediate results. A gunner firing can feel his impact. A tank crew advancing can see the ground gained. A camouflage team fitting canvas over a tank sees nothing but dust, sweat, and the risk of failure. Their work is judged by absence, the absence of enemy reaction, the absence of accurate anticipation, the absence of the enemy reserve at the decisive point. That kind of work requires a different kind of discipline, a faith that the invisible can shape the visible. After El Alamein, the Axis retreat westward. The strategic momentum in North Africa shifts. The battle becomes a symbol of turning tide. It is followed by further operations, by landings and advances, by the long push that will eventually squeeze Axis forces in Tunisia. But the story of Bertram lives in the background of that larger narrative as proof that deception can function, not as a trick, but as an operational tool integrated with logistics and combat planning. It is a reminder that the map room can be as deadly as the battlefield, because what commanders believe determines what armies do. In the years that follow, the concepts used in Bertram echo through later operations. The idea of dummy formations, false radio traffic, and misdirection becomes more sophisticated. The idea of building an enemy narrative and supporting it with consistent observable evidence becomes a core principle of operational deception. Yet Bertram remains distinctive because of its physical audacity, disguising tanks as lorries by day and moving them as tanks by night sounds like a story designed for a novel, but it was real. And it was done not by a handful of magicians, but by an army that decided to treat camouflage as a weapon. There is a final detail that captures the essence of the operation in a desert war. You can sometimes measure the truth by the tracks in the sand. Tracks do not lie. They show where vehicles went, how many, how often, and in what pattern. Bertram had to manage tracks the way a writer manages sentences. It had to create some tracks to support a false narrative and hide others to protect a real one. It had to use existing routes, cover new ones, and avoid leaving a signature that would betray the main effort. In other words, Bertram had to rewrite the desert's own memory. When you can do that, you are not merely hiding. You are shaping what the enemy thinks is happening, and you are forcing him to fight the war you want him to fight. So when the guns open at El Alamein and the night becomes a continuous flash of artillery, remember that the battle did not begin with the first shell. It began weeks earlier with canvas and paint, with dummy shapes placed in the sun, with a pipeline that promised a later attack, with tanks that pretended to be lorries, and with commanders who understood that the most valuable ground is sometimes the ground inside the enemy's mind. Operation Bertram was not a miracle. It was labor, repetition, and a cold understanding of how people interpret the world when they are afraid of being wrong. And in a war, where one wrong guess can doom an army, making the enemy guess wrong could be as decisive as any brigade of tanks.